All right. So I did my project on translation in programming languages. So to start, what is a programming language? Well, programming language, in the most basic way to define it, is a way to tell a computer to do something. So we have here on the right a graph, a pie graph of the most commonly used programming languages this past year. They are all in English, and these two pictures here on the left are two different programming languages that do the exact same thing. So we have the top one here is a lot larger than the bottom one, and we'll get into that a little bit later. So those were examples of English programming languages. Here are examples of non-English programming languages that I found on a Wikipedia page. Sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but basically the column on the very left is the the human language. The one just to the side of that is the name of the programming language and that human language. And then the one next to that is what it's used for. It's mostly things like educational purposes, and pseudocode and stuff like that. So here are some terms that we have a side by side of. The side on the left is Python in English. The side on the right is Python in Spanish. So the Spanish Python does exist. It's a programming language. However, it is mostly entirely pseudocode and can't compile or run any actual software. So that is a problem that we can talk about later. We will talk about later. And um, here are some examples of the syntax. This next one right here is just an example of some methods and the translation of methods. So a method is basically a manipulator of an object in programming. So you have an object called a list. This is the example for list, and a list can be a list of anything. So, for example, a list of numbers. And if you want to manipulate that list, you just add a method to it and it'll change it. If you want to order it or sort it, you just do that list dot sort. So the point of these methods is to be, or at least the names, is to be as intuitive as possible. You want to know what it does just by looking at the name. So, for example, sort, you can assume that's going to sort the list, probably from least to greatest. And it's super easy. That makes it really easy to translate these words, and they're also just verbs. So that makes it super easy too. Just one word and a verb, and that doesn't seem too much like a challenge. And on top of that, all of programming languages are extremely customizable. You can make comments in your own language, in Spanish, for example. You can name methods, make your own methods, and name those in your native language. You can, if you're making outputs to the screen so that the user can see words, you can make that in the language of the demographic of your users. So it's actually quite customizable, the language that you're programming in. So, what is the real problem then if translating isn't necessarily the problem? Well, we can look at this problem, which is translation from one programming language to another programming language. I have two videos here. The one on the left is Python, the coding language Python. The one on the right is Swift UI. Now, both of these do the exact same thing. However, the one on the left is much shorter and easier to read, and the one on the right is confusing, and sometimes it feels like it's unnecessarily confusing. But um, the reason why I made the one on the right is because that is the only one, or that, sorry, not the only one, but it's the one that's compatible with um, Apple apps, with iOS apps. So if we want to make an app, we have to use this language here that's on the right. And we use the demo on the left as a guideline for how we want the one on the right to run. Um, so that is a huge problem with translating, is you having to know these languages to conform to either your company or to the certain, I guess, software that you're trying to use. So that's one problem. Here's the other problem. We can talk about human languages again. Is that every global company in the world uses programming languages in English, mostly because the English programming languages are the only ones that run actual software and are not just pseudocode. like I said earlier, all other languages that are not in English are just pseudocode, mostly used for training, educational purposes, and do not actually run software. And as I was researching this, I was thinking, well, what about huge companies like Nintendo, where 50% of the employees are Japanese? And I thought, they'd maybe use some kind of Japanese coding language, but that is incorrect. They use all English based programming languages. For example, the Nintendo Switch is largely coded in C++, just like the PS5 and the Xbox. And even when they were starting out, their older consoles, like the SNES, the Game Boy, were coded in assembly and C, which are way more complicated because they're older. But here's an example down here of how a programmer that speaks Japanese might write some code. So right here, they have a comment in Japanese that explains to other programmers what it does, what this line of code does. And also this word enemy speed could also be customizable. He could have named it, or she could have named it something Japanese. They chose not to in this example, however. But yeah. So here's some strategies and solutions to these problems. So the main problem is transferring or learning another programming language that is required for your company, or trying to learn how to program and English is not your first language. So here are some strategies. You can learn the algorithms, the data structures in your own language first. And here's some websites here on the side that are excellent at doing that. This top one here actually changes the syntax, the English syntax to another language, which is really cool. It is pseudocode, meaning it doesn't actually run software, but once you learn the concepts of how to do things, it translates easily, or more easier to the other languages. And then these ones down here are, instead of writing like lines of code like a nerd, you drag blocks of code over that have a description of how to do something, and the description is in the language of whatever your machine is configured in. So if you have a Spanish computer, the description will be in Spanish, and then you can learn the principles of coding in that way. Here's another theoretical solution. This is kind of the reason I wanted to do my project on programming, is because we have a similar project in another class I'm taking, where we are making our own programming language. And here, these green words are key indicators, like characters that the machine is looking for that indicate the start of a word, for example, or the start of a function or method. And then it goes from there. It's the instructions on how to run the program. So I was thinking, hey, what if we make a flag, some sort of true or false flag that indicates whether or not we use the English lexer or Spanish lexer. This method is called a lexer. So this is something I had in mind. Maybe that'll allow it to compile in the same environment. As far as my research tells me that hasn't been done, but also at the same time, it is not necessarily a huge desire people have to do, just because, as I mentioned earlier, programming languages to start with are pretty customizable. You can do a lot of things in your own language, name a lot of variables, whatever you want, and so it might not be entirely helpful to do that. But what do you guys think? Do you think we should have programming languages in other human languages so that the English language isn't dominant in that field of study? Or do you think what we have right now is sufficient to help people who don't speak English feel like that is a barrier to learning how to program? Yeah, it's just some things to think about. But that is my presentation. Thanks so much for listening.